right. Open your Bibles with me, if you would, to Exodus chapter 13. Exodus 13. And we return to the narrative of the Exodus story. Let me ask you a question. Do you remember, for some of you this might be going way into the annals of past history, for others not quite so much, but do you remember those last few hours of spring classwork in high school, right before summer break? Do you remember what that was like? I remember when I was younger, a lot younger, the last days of school were almost worthless. We'd already taken all the tests, and we spent pretty much the whole day goofing off. We were just aching to hear that final bell go off, indicating the end of the school year, right? I was part of a particularly rambunctious senior class, and one of my classmates commandeered the PA system in the school. As that last bell went off, he piped through all the speakers of the school a rowdy song that some of you may know about school's out. Once that bell went off and everyone was free, we were gone, right? There was no direction, there was no organization, there was no structure. We were just free. What does that kind of chaos communicate? Chaos. It doesn't communicate any kind of discipline, does it? No. We come to the text in Exodus 13 this morning, and it resumes, the story resumes in a very orderly way. It is Yahweh God who is leading the nation of Israel out of slavery into freedom. And he has a plan for Israel in their freedom. Read with me, if you would, in chapter 13, verses 17 through 22, where we find Yahweh's divine protection and orientation for the journey. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, "Lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt." But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here." And they moved on from Succoth and camped in Etham, on the edge of the wilderness. And Yahweh went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them all along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, and that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. Now there's a couple of things that we want to observe in this first paragraph here. First of all, notice verse number 17. I find this text fascinating. In a broader context, we've been seeing this from the beginning of the story of Exodus. It has been emphasized, the sovereignty of God over the heart of Pharaoh, right? I mean, that's been a point that Moses has hammered since the beginning of the story. And yet here we see that Yahweh chooses for an Exodus route, he chooses a certain route based on the heart condition of the Israelites. Notice what he says, "Lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt." So God led them by the way, not by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. So when there was in that day a trade route, a road that ran from Egypt up to the Promised Land. It was pretty much a straight shot around the lake. It would be like taking I-90 out to Michigan. Just follow the route right around the edge of the lake there. It's a straight route from one place to the other. Easy peasy. Except that if they went on that route, they would have gone right through the land of the Philistines. The Philistine land bordered the Egyptian land, and the Philistines were an aggressive people. And so Yahweh, what does it say? Yahweh does not want the people's minds to change when they see war and return to Egypt. Now, The significance of this is that when we read that Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, we should not understand that statement to be that Yahweh is exercising some kind of arbitrary or coercive power over Pharaoh, causing Pharaoh to do what he otherwise would not have wanted to do. If that had been the case, then Yahweh could have simply softened the heart of the Israelites and made them trust in him and not have any problems going through the war, you see? Rather, we understand that there are two factors involved here. God is sovereign over the hearts of men, and at the same time, people are responsible for their actions. People do what they want to do. And if Israel had seen war, they would have returned to Egypt because that's what they would have wanted to do. In other words, Israel needed to grow in her faith in Yahweh, before she would be ready to see the war of conflict as the army of Yahweh. That's a phrase that has come up a few times. This Israel is the army of Yahweh. Notice what it said in verse number 18. This is the people of Israel equipped for battle. And if they're going to face war as the army of Yahweh, they need to grow in their faith a whole lot before they're ready for that kind of a conflict. That's the point. Notice also, throughout this whole passage, the emphasis is on the presence of Yahweh with Israel. He goes before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. These are marvelous signs, reminders of the presence of Yahweh with his people. He wants his people to trust him, to grow in their faith in him, and so he provides them with this stunning visual display of his presence. Yahweh is graciously leading his people. And so all seems well. It seems that Yahweh will peacefully lead his people to the promised land with no more conflict or difficulty, right? And yet now we encounter what I call the divine conspiracy, because it reveals the divine purposing behind the human events that are going on. Read with me in the next section, chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pihahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Zephon, and you shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, all his army. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh." And they did so. God intends to humble Egypt and bring her to her knees. That's his purpose. That's what he's going to do. And he does this through extraordinary circumstances. First, Israel is instructed to turn back and set up camp. Apparently, Israel is making a straight line retreat from Egypt by way of the Red Sea. Here, God says, now stop, go back a little ways, and create this appearance of being lost in the wilderness. It's as though Israel is supposed to appear as though she is unsure where she is going, or perhaps fearful to actually commit to heading into the wilderness. Egypt is supposed to think that Israel is lost and vulnerable and open to attack. And we read that Yahweh will harden the hearts of the Egyptians one final time. And through this hardening, Yahweh will win total victory over Egypt. Now notice, God doesn't say what he's going to do. We know, we've read the story. We've heard the story since we were little kids. They have no idea what God's going to do here. All they know is that Yahweh has promised to once and for all settle this question of his glory over Egypt. And so what happens? It would seem that Yahweh has, in a sense, baited Pharaoh into a crime of opportunity, right? Israel seems to be lost and confused and wandering, and Egypt is certainly by now starting to regret her decision in liberating this slave people. Notice with me what the text says in verses 5 through 9. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people, And they said, "What is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So he made ready his chariots and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all them. And Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he pursued the people of Israel, while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them, and camped at the sea by Pihahiroth in front of Baal-zephon. Now, think about this in terms of a timeline, if you will. Some period of time has passed. It's not like these events happened the day after Israel had left Egypt. You can imagine that the economy of Egypt is crippled at this point. After the fallout of the 10 plagues, Egypt is economically destroyed. Not only that, but now news reports are reaching Egypt that Israel is bumbling around in the middle of the desert on the border of Egypt, apparently unconvinced that they're really ready to make an escape to the land of Canaan. Perhaps by now Egypt has had the time to bury all of their dead and start to assess the situation of Egypt. And so Pharaoh and his servants talk and conspire and decide to go after the Israelites and recapture them. After all, their God, Yahweh, has certainly exhausted his powers. He has exhausted himself in pouring out these plagues over Egypt. Surely he's whooped. Now is the perfect time to recapture this people of Israel and bring them back. And so Pharaoh leaves with his armies to go after Israel. We're reminded that all of this is in some sense provoked or caused by Yahweh. Yahweh is ensuring that Pharaoh persists in hardened rebellion. Notice what verse number 8 says. He says that the people of Israel were going out defiantly. Now this word, defiantly, it's the word for an upraised hand. Okay? This is important because this word hand is going to become a key word in the story of this Red Sea crossing. You remember how we talked a few weeks ago about how people in this day, they would retell these stories orally. And so they would use certain literary devices to keep the attention of the people or to indicate for the people the beginning of a story or the end of the story. For example, we talked about how storytellers would sometimes use the same phrase at the beginning of the story and at the end of the story to indicate that the story was complete. You remember we talked about that? Another part, another linguistic tool, if I can put it that way, that they would use is the repetition of a key word. Now, this isn't in every story, but in some stories, you'll find one word that is repeated throughout the story to give cohesion to the whole story, to make the whole story flow together. Well, what we're about to see is that this word hand, the word hand, is a key word in this story of the Red Sea. And so in my Bible, I have this word defiantly. I have it underlined, and all the other uses of hand underlined to kind of show me how this whole story is flowing together. Now, all of Pharaoh's armies have come after Israel, and they have overtaken Israel. And the idea isn't that they've busted through the camp of Israel, not yet. The idea is that they're on the horizon. So Israel can see Egypt right there in the distance. Egypt can see Israel there in the distance. They've made contact. And now it's sort of a waiting game, a strategy game to see what comes next. Notice the next section, verses 10 through 14. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to Yahweh. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And Moses said to the people, "Fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. Yahweh will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." We see here in these verses a contrast between, if I can put it this way, between the reaction of the Israelites and the response of Moses. Have you ever considered the difference between a reaction and a response? Have you thought about those? Perhaps, perhaps not. A reaction is that first and natural thing that we think or that we do when we're confronted with a certain situation, a certain stimulus. A response is different. A response is measured, it's thoughtful, it's careful. Frequently, a reaction it's passionate and sudden. It doesn't reflect careful thought or consideration of a situation. It reflects instinct, if we can put it that way. A response, on the other hand, it will breathe, take a breath, it will consider, it may even pray. A response will frequently reflect the orientation of our affections rather than simply our passions at that moment. It's a lesson to learn, just a kind of a parenthesis here. It's always the wise thing to respond and not react. It's very, very easy to react when we're faced with a tough situation. In that moment, the natural thing that we always do is react, right? But it shows a certain amount of faith in God to wait, breathe, pray, and then respond to make sure that our interaction with that situation is something that actually honors God. What we see in these verses is a reaction from the Israelites and a response from Moses. Both Moses and the Israelites, they face the same circumstance. The same Egyptian army stands before both of them. And yet the two responses are entirely different. The people, when they're faced with this oncoming Egyptian army, they fear and they question Moses. Notice the difference between verse number 8 and the statement of their fear. Verse number 8 said, the people were going out defiantly, or going out with boldness. And now here they are, just a couple verses later, reacting in fear. Moses, on the other hand, responds in faith, declaring Yahweh's intention to fight for the people. Verse 11 is almost funny. What is Egypt famous for? When I say Egypt, you think pyramids. Yes, exactly. What are the pyramids? Graves, elaborate graves. Can you picture Israel pointing at the pyramids and saying, is it because there's no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here? Kind of ironic, isn't it? And yet, verse 12 in modern terminology, we would call verse 12 misinformation. Verse 12, is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians? That's not what Israel said in Egypt. Do you remember what Israel said in Egypt? Yahweh has heard us. And they fell down and they worshiped. Do you remember that? Chapter 4, verse towards the end. I don't remember the verse number, but it's there. Their response was one of worship. They were glad Yahweh had heard their cries and was coming to save them. And now they're saying, we told you to leave us alone. Again, this is a reaction of fear. It's not a response of faith. And these words, they border on despair. Notice, however, the purpose of Yahweh. Verses 15 through 18. Yahweh said to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand, here's our key word, hand, over the sea and divide it. And the people of Israel, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So in these verses, God is declaring to Moses what is the end of this conflict between him and the Egyptians. He has promised now the way that he is going to defeat the Egyptian army. But notice, Yahweh not only proclaims what is the end of this conflict, but he proclaims the purpose of that end. Again, I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. You know, these purpose statements have been a key part of this whole Exodus story up until now. Every step of the way, Yahweh has been declaring his purpose. There is a reason why he is dealing with Egypt in this manner. He is displaying who he is. He wants Egypt to see him clearly. He wants Israel to see him clearly. He wants the nations to see him clearly. Do you remember all those purpose statements that we've encountered in the text? 6:7, the verse of the month that we have been memorizing. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Right? Then you shall know that I am Yahweh your God, who brings you up from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Chapter 7 and verse number 5. The Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh when I stretch out my hand against them and bring out the people of Israel from among them. Before the first plague, Yahweh said to Pharaoh, chapter 7, verse 17, Thus says Yahweh, by this you shall know that I am Yahweh. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn to blood. Before the fourth plague, Yahweh said to Pharaoh in chapter 8 and verse 22, But on that day I will set apart the land of Goshen where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am Yahweh in the midst of the people. Most famously, before the seventh plague, Yahweh said to Pharaoh in chapter 9 and verse 16, But for this purpose I have raised you, Pharaoh, up, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. Before the eighth plague, Yahweh said to Moses in chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, Go in to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am Yahweh. We just read in chapter 14 and verse number 4, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue him, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, and the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh. And now, finally, as Yahweh prepares this judgment of the Red Sea, verses 17 and 18, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. The nations, Egypt, and probably even Israel, have given themselves to idolatry. They attribute to false gods the sovereignty that belongs only to Yahweh. They attribute to false gods the strength that belongs only to Yahweh. They attribute to false gods the glory that belongs only to Yahweh. And the purpose of Yahweh, which he has declared over and over and over again, is to display his glory, to demonstrate that he alone is God. And it's not just that he alone is Yahweh, it's that Yahweh alone is God. There is no other God. And he will finally accomplish this purpose through the parting of the Red Sea. So we find in verses 19 through 29 the climax of this story. Notice with me. Then the angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand, there's our key word, over the sea. And Yahweh drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch, Yahweh in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from before Israel, for Yahweh fights for them against the Egyptians." Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, Yahweh threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Of all the hosts of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Verses 19 to 21 here show the preparation and the protection of Yahweh. Yahweh prepared Israel's escape under the cloak of night, providing darkness against the Egyptians and a wind to divide the sea. This cloud was not only working in front of Israel, but it's now somehow above Israel and behind Israel, keeping Egypt at bay and providing a way in front. Yahweh's care was a complete care for Israel. Notice how this miracle unfolds. Yahweh sends a wind which blows all night long, and the wind causes that water to divide. Now, it's clear that what's being described here is a miraculous event. A mere wind, no matter how strong it is, cannot cause water to divide and create dry land as described in these verses. And if such a wind were to blow and continue to blow such that the walls stood up high on the right and on the left, the wind would be blowing too strong for anybody to walk through on their own 2 feet. So what is being described in this passage is clearly a miracle. God acts miraculously to free his people. He provided a way of escape where there was no escape humanly possible. He interceded miraculously for his people. It's interesting. Verse 23 kind of leaves us hanging. As we go through the story, we read this: the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Now what? Not only is Israel in the midst of the sea, but the Egyptians are in there too. Yahweh has, until now, protected Israel from the forces of Egypt. And he has promised to continue that protection. But how will this protection come to pass? How will Yahweh gain glory over the Egyptians? And along comes verse 24. And in the morning watch, Yahweh looked out from the pillar. Now, do you remember when we were studying earlier on in the plagues? We noticed that Yahweh waited until things grew worse and worse, to the point where they couldn't get any worse without the destruction of Israel. Do you remember that? In the story of the plagues, Moses included that genealogy, that strange genealogy of Moses and Aaron and the others, right in the middle of that story to kind of mark off the line of things getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and then Yahweh starting to act. Do you remember that? Well, this is kind of like that right here. In that case, Moses used a genealogy to kind of mark the line, if you will. Here, there's this interesting phrase, "and in the morning watch." You could actually translate this there's a little phrase in here, "and it happened that in the morning watch." It's kind of like that. It's a transition. Like he's been building and building and building, and now what's going to happen? Well, it happened that In the morning watch, Yahweh looked out from the pillar, and Yahweh interceded. What happens? Yahweh in the pillar of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into panic. Now, this phrase tells us a few different things. First of all, the cloud is in some way, again, it's above the fleeing Israelites. And it's also somehow behind, protecting them from Egypt actually catching them. Second, this verse actually tells us who the angel of the Lord is. That the angel of Yahweh is, in some sense, Yahweh. The angel of God has already been associated with this pillar of fire and cloud. He said earlier that Yahweh went, chapter 13, verse 21, Yahweh went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to guide them by night. And so now we're seeing that the angel of Yahweh is in this pillar of cloud. And so the angel of Yahweh is somehow Yahweh. Now this is interesting because Israel somehow, they understand that Yahweh is one. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. And yet somehow Yahweh is up there and he's the angel of Yahweh. Somehow these two are, at least these two are one Yahweh. In other words, the Trinity is definitely a New Testament revelation, but it's not an entire surprise. There are hints here in the Old Testament text of that great truth that's revealed through the gospel. As a third important thing that we need to notice in this phrase in verse number 24, and that is that Yahweh knows what's happening. Was Yahweh somehow surprised by Egypt's presence in the sea? Oh, whoops, a few of them got through there. No. Yahweh knew what was going on. He had planned what is going on. Did he need to look down to see what was going on? No. He knows what's going on. We're told that he looked down in order to draw out the fact that Yahweh knows what is going on and Yahweh is about to act. And act he does. The text says that he threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so that they drove heavily. Yahweh begins to interfere. He begins to mess with the chariots of the Egyptians in such a way that they knew that Yahweh was acting. What do they say? Let us flee from before Israel. Now notice, for Yahweh fights for them against the Egyptians. They understand. They get it. They know that Yahweh is acting. Notice this extremely vulnerable position that they have put themselves into. And now Yahweh is acting against them. They have nowhere to go. God has set a trap, and this trap is about to spring. Notice what Yahweh says to Moses. Verse 26, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. This is it. This is the final moment. With one action, mediated by Moses, Yahweh once and for all destroys this enemy of Israel. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, Yahweh threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Of all the hosts of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked out on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Yahweh has conquered the enemy. There is no more Egyptian army. As far as we can tell, Pharaoh did survive this event. He did not enter into the sea with his army, but the army was completely destroyed. The final verses here, verses 30 and 31, provide a summary of the story and a chance for us to reflect on God's miraculous redemption. Thus, Yahweh saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw this word power is actually the word hand. Israel saw the great hand that Yahweh used against the Egyptians. So the people feared Yahweh, and they believed in Yahweh and in his servant Moses. So Moses places this story of the Exodus as a contrast between two hands or powers. So Yahweh saved Israel that day from the hand or the power of the Egyptians. Israel saw the great hand or power that Yahweh used against the Egyptians. Yahweh said from the beginning that he would demonstrate his glory and make his power known. That was his purpose. And that is exactly what he did. He showed his hand over the Egyptians. Here was Israel, a small people, unremarkable and enslaved. And yet the Most High God, Yahweh, took count of them. He loved them. He chose them as his people. He saw them in their slavery, in their helplessness, and he interceded for them. In this intercession for them, he redeemed them to himself as an inheritance forever. And though the powers against them pursued them to bring them back into slavery, Yahweh interceded and completely vanquished and destroyed the powers of slavery, the powers of evil. And in accomplishing this great salvation for his people, he demonstrated his great glory of mercy and grace through judgment. Now, you put it that way, does that sound familiar? It shouldn't be a surprise to us. Through this redemption of Israel, Yahweh set the pattern for how he would continue to save his people. It's for this reason that we read further on in the stories of the exile and the promise that Israel would return from exile, that it's this Exodus language that is used to describe God's bringing Israel back from exile among the nations. It's for that reason that Israel always remembered the Exodus through the Psalms throughout her history. That psalm we read this morning at our call to worship was probably written in the time of David. It was not written right after the Exodus. Israel always remembered this moment in her history. It's also for this reason that the cross reminds us of the Exodus. Yahweh has once more redeemed his people, but not from slavery in Egypt. We, the people of God, have been redeemed from the power of sin and death. We were slaves, helpless and hopeless. We were not a people. There was nothing about us which pleased God. And yet Yahweh looked down and had mercy on us. Yahweh himself came down as the Son and redeemed us through his own death. What is the response of the people of God to the display of the power of Yahweh? Yahweh did all of this so that he would get glory over Egypt. What does it look like for Yahweh to get glory? What does that mean? How do we give glory to Yahweh? Notice the text. So the people feared Yahweh, and they believed in Yahweh and in his servant Moses. The response to the mighty hand of Yahweh is a response which gives Yahweh glory, which is to say, it is a response which fears Yahweh and believes him. Fear and faith, in this sense, go hand in hand. Now, when we talk about fear, we're not describing this cowering, servile fear that characterized Israel as they looked back at the coming Egyptian army coming after them. It's a different kind of fear. And we'll return to this idea in a few weeks. It's really important in the text. But for now, let me define the fear of the Lord as this. It is a respectful reverence and obedience for God, grounded in faith and motivated by love. The fear of Yahweh is a respectful reverence and obedience for God, grounded in faith and motivated by love. You cannot separate faith and love from a proper fear of Yahweh. nor can you separate reverence and obedience. They go together. This is the response which Yahweh desires from his people, a response of faith and fear. Do you see this Yahweh as your God of your Exodus? Have you been set free from the slavery to sin by the mighty redemption of Yahweh? He has done that for you, that you may see him in his beauty and fear him and believe him. Is your life characterized by this fear of Yahweh? Do you have a respectful reverence and obedience for God, grounded in faith and motivated by love? Does that describe your relationship with this one true God? Yahweh intends to get glory in your life. He intends for you to respond to his sovereign work in your life with this kind of faith and fear. So look to him. Trust in his providence, not just in saving your soul from death, but also in bringing you through the challenges and the circumstances of life. Because even in these, he is demonstrating his great glory. He will get glory from you for your life. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for this text. I thank you for how you demonstrate your glory in the Exodus. Father, this great example, this certainly analogy, certainly parable, but far more than that, this is the true story of your redemption of Israel. And yet more profoundly, it is a picture, it is an illustration of this redemption which you have made of each of us. Father, I thank you that you have redeemed our souls. Father, I pray for my brothers and sisters. I pray for my own heart. Father, that we would see your glory in our lives. Father, that our response, no matter the circumstances of our lives, that our response would be one of the fear of Yahweh. That we would look to you, our God. That we would honor you, that we would reverence you above all else, and that we would obey you before all else. Father, that our walk with you would be grounded in faith and motivated by love. Father, I pray that on Wednesday morning as we wake up and we're only halfway through the week and you have brought more circumstances into our lives, Father, that our waking would be a waking of faith. It is only by grace that we wake believing. It is only by grace that we wake fearing your name and seeing your glory. Father, I pray that that would be the case for each of us as we go through our week this week. That your name would be exalted in our lives as we deal with the situations that you bring into our lives. That our responses would be responses and not merely reactions. That we would measure our responses by your love for us. Father, I pray all these things in the name of our Savior Jesus. Amen.
Amen.